I am Sydney McKinney. I am the Executive Director of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening as we honor the lives and the experiences and the resistance of system-impacted Black women and girls. The National Black Women's Justice Institute is a Black women-led national nonprofit working to end the criminalization and confinement of Black women and girls by researching, elevating, and educating the public about community-led solutions to advance our safety, healing, and well-being. As Women's History Month comes to a close this week, we thought it was important for us to spotlight and put attention on the very long history of the systemic criminalization and punishment of Black women and girls. Over the past decades, the women's prison population has grown at a distressing rate, outpacing the growth of the men's prison population by almost double, and even increasing in some states where men's incarceration rate is decreasing. And like Black men, Black women and girls are also disproportionately represented in places of confinement, accounting for 29% of incarcerated women and 43% of girls in youth detention, according to the most recent data available. And it's so important for us to remember that the systemic criminalization and punishment of Black women and girls is not a recent phenomenon. Thanks to Black women historians, including the esteemed scholars that are joining us tonight, who have been at the forefront of elevating the stories and experiences of criminalized Black women and girls, we know that policing and incarceration have been used as tools to marginalize and harm us dating back to emancipation. For as long as the carceral system has existed in the United States, Black women and girls have been subjected to state violence as a way to exert its dominance over us and control our bodily autonomy, our sexuality, the strategies we use to secure economic independence. And because of their work, we also know about Black women's efforts to resist, subvert, and transform the criminal legal system. So I want to thank you all for joining tonight's conversation with Doctors Bailey, Harris, Hicks, and LeFlouria as we explore the lives and experiences of directly impacted Black women and girls throughout history to help us better understand the criminal legal and penal systems and devise effective strategies for dismantling the punitive paradigm that exists and build in its place pathways to healing and opportunity for Black women and girls. So without further ado, please let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Dionne Bailey, Assistant Professor of History at Colgate University. Next, we have Dr. LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University, followed by Dr. Cheryl Hicks, Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware. And finally, we have Dr. Talitha LeFlouria, Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. You all know, because I have shared this, I think that historians are amazing and have really been inspired so much personally by your work and others like you. And when I was working on my graduate degree, my doctoral degree, looking for inspiration around studying the experiences of Black women and girls, historians were really at the forefront of the folks whose work I found most impactful, most inspiring, and really most deeply intentional. So I just want to thank you so much for all of the scholarship that you all have collectively produced. And so to kick us off, I want to first ask, what motivates and inspires your work? And how do you see your work in connection with NBWJI's mission to end the systemic criminalization of Black women and girls? We'll start first with Dr. Bailey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this question. I have taken a little bit of time to think about this, and really for me, my work really is it's like a liberatory practice for me. It sort of informs everything I do, how I move about the world, how I think about the world, my place in it, other Black women and Black girls' places in the world. And in thinking about how we can, sort of not only stop overlooking the criminalization of Black girls and women, but put them at the forefront of this so important conversation, that, when we think about abolition, when we think about what it means to critique the criminal justice system, and how we really have to sort of change the narrative and say, yes, Black women and girls are really being affected by this national problem, which is incarceration. And so that's really how I see myself connecting to the organization, and just sort of really trying to make sure that I always keep Black girls and women at the forefront of everything I do in all of my work.
Thank you. Dr. Harris, how about
Thank
you?
you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I very much like Dr. Bailey, I see this as an intellectual calling to tell such stories about Black women and girls criminalization and victimization, to really bring some of these stories to the public's attention, to share the hidden stories and struggles of Black women, and to share hidden expressions of resistance. And for some of us, I think this, these concepts and these realities of criminalization and confinement and victimization really hits home, as many of us have witnessed and experienced criminalization, surveillance, and confinement. And like the National Black Women's Justice Institute, I see this in terms as being a historian and a writer, really to research and elevate and educate the public about some of these stories that often go unhidden or go hidden.
Thank you. How about you, Dr. Hicks?
I think that I agree with everything that has been said in terms of this being an intellectual calling. And I think that some of what I want to add is that the thing that motivates me is also this dedication to Black women's history. As an undergrad, I took a class on Black women's history, and it opened up a space for me to see myself and to see the world really differently. And so I became a historian because I wanted to research and write about and teach Black women's history. And one of the folks who I thought I was, most fascinated by was a 20th century activist named Ella Baker. And her work, and particularly her vision for social change, I think has shaped the work that I've done around Black women and girls and their communities, even though I'm looking at an earlier period of time. So again, I think this is a way to, this work motivates me and inspires me because it is about elevating Black women and girls and their histories and their experiences and making a connection. I mean, the connection I made with Sydney, I think was 3 or 4 years ago. I don't even think we even have met in person, but you asked me to participate on a panel in Brooklyn, and I was like, I'll be there. COVID happened and we were not able to meet, but we've done some really important work in terms of programming. And I've learned so much from this organization. So I just think that, the vision for social change has been something that has been on my mind, and it shapes my work, and it motivates me to do the kind of work around letting the public know, as well as students know, about the history of the criminalization of Black women and girls.
Thank you. And Dr. LeFlouria, how about you?
So my peers have essentially summarized everything that I would want to say. And I think that just speaks to the alignment, right, that we have and our shared commitment to advocate on behalf of Black women and girls who have been victimized by our criminal legal system. And so my mission, or what drives me, is a desire to, one, raise public awareness about the impact that mass incarceration and policing has had on Black women's lives, not just in the contemporary, but literally for probably the past 200 years. Black women have been unjustly targeted, have been over-policed and underprotected since the period of slavery. And so as a scholar of slavery's legacies, of Black women's history, of the history of Black women's incarceration in our country, it's really important to me that I use history and use my scholarship as a way to highlight and expose the historical injustices that Black women have faced in this country for centuries. And so I really appreciate the work that NBWJI is doing to raise awareness about the impact of policing and incarceration on Black women and girls. And so that is what brings me to this forum. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate with you in this, what Dr. Bailey calls liberatory project.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. This is, I have to echo what Mimi put into the chat. And Mimi said that they are so encouraged and inspired by the women on this panel. And I just have to second and +1 and carrot, all the things that the young people do in the chats these days. I feel that this is just such an inspiring group and so excited to be here. And Dr. LeFlouria, you touched on this a little in your response, but I'm curious from each of you, what are the similarities you see between the ways in which and the practices of criminalizing and punishing Black women today with what you all have studied at the different periods in our history? So I know, for example, Dr. Hicks, you're really focused on the turn of the century in the Northeast. And so what do you see as the vestiges of the past that are visible in our criminal legal system and policing today?
Well, I can start by answering that question. So I am a scholar who studies and researches the history of Black women's incarceration in the post-Civil War South and the exploitation of Black women's labor through a system known as convict leasing, where Black women were essentially forced to labor for private industries without pay. They were physically abused, sexually abused, their labor was commodified, and their experiences were very similar to slavery. And so when I think about the historical legacies of the criminal legal system and mass incarceration, for example, and I think about some of the similarities with today's system, I can't overlook the racial disparities, right? So during the period of convict leasing, nearly in the state of Georgia, for example, nearly 100% of the female prison population consisted of Black women. After emancipation in most Southern states, over 80% of the female prison and jail populations consisted of Black women. So when we consider the fact that 1 in 100 Black women are under the supervision of the criminal legal system, including those who are on probation and parole, it's not lost on me that these racial disparities continue, right? And that they didn't begin with the war on drugs, but they really began during a much earlier period. And so another parallel that I see involves the impact of mass incarceration on Black women's lives, particularly as it pertains to the family separation epidemic, which obviously is rooted in slavery. And so when we look at the war on drugs and look at the proliferation of the foster care system during that time period, it is no coincidence that there were more Black children that entered the system during the same time that the war on drugs was waged, right? And we understand that Black women outpaced white women in that war, were incarcerated at a rate of 8-to-1 when compared with white women. And so I think it's important to pay attention to those disparities and the family separation epidemic. I could point to a million other examples, but those are the two that stand out the most.
Yeah, thank you for that, Talitha. I see it in really similar ways. I also think about the reach of carcerality or the carceral reach. Not just about like cages, but women also are subjected to the sorts of the logics, like the ideologies, the practices, and the structures that are really invested in tangible and sometimes intangible ways, in punitive orientations to like difference, to poverty, and to the struggles for justice. And the other thing that I think that we can see across time and space is this whole idea of this type of slow violence that, I mean, many Black people are subjected to, but women and girls are subjected to in particular. And by slow violence, I'm talking about, a violence that is, short and long-term, really immeasurable, debilitating physical, emotional, psychological trauma. It's like what, many scholars would call a slow violence, but a violence that's really not, it's not explosive necessarily, it's not visible or spectacular, but sometimes a form of violence that is gradual, it's veiled, it's delayed in destruction. And it's a kind of attritional violence that is really typically not seen as violence. So I think that there's this whole carceral reach that has these wide tentacles that obviously you see within cages, but also extend beyond cages. And this is why I think when we talk about policing and criminalization, we forget about that slow violence that's happening to women internally. If we miss it, we oftentimes don't have these conversations about it, and we oftentimes don't write about it.
Yes, and I think for me, thank you, Dr. Harris and Dr. LeFlouria, and just thinking about sort of where my work is situated, and I particularly look at Mississippi, but for me, thinking about the connections, I often think about how, just say in Mississippi, right, like most white men historically have always thought themselves to have this unlimited, unfettered access to Black girls and Black women, particularly their labor. So where Dr. LeFlouria is particularly looking, and she's mentioning the convict leasing system, and you have that in Mississippi, but then in Mississippi, white men, particularly these doctors and lawyers, began to sort of drum up in their minds like, well, we can make other people wealthy, or we can use Black women and girls' labor to make not only the state wealthy, but make ourselves, enhance our own wealth. And so it seems that they had this sort of just undeniable sort of reach or want to control Black girls and Black women. And they saw no difference, right? They considered a 9-year-old girl a woman, a 12-year-old girl a woman, or 80-year-old woman a woman, right? And in this kind of context where Black girls and women's, their womanhood was stripped from them, but they still looked at them, all the same, right? There was no difference in thinking about age. And so in thinking about that and thinking about this unlimited access and how that led to, mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and how we see that even today when, all of us can look on social media and see images of white truancy officers, white men attacking young girls in schools, right? Police officers are attacking young girls in schools or on the street, right, in their own yards. And so it's just like this long continuing history of stripping Black women of their and girls of their humanity and their, sort of their gender. They become genderless to a lot of these people. And so in how that historically is sort of rooted in racism and sexism, and how that fuels how it fuels incarceration. And then how the gaze on that looks, right? People tune into that. They tune into TV shows that are about women, or women behind bars, and mostly we see Black women being the victims of those kind of profits for major TV networks. So for me, I see that in the victims in 1890, 1900, 1910 were Black girls and women, and I see that sort of long history continuing today.
But brought up a lot of this material, because when I think about my own work in New York, one of the things that I think about is the ways in which the connections are there from the 19th century from reformers who are actually saying, I want to protect these young girls in particular, but their protection was seen through the lens of regulation. So one of the things that I actually see as being, that we still see is, I look at what was later called wayward minor laws. So some of the behavior of young girls is actually criminalized. So, you know, Dr. Bailey just talked about truancy, but so, you know, in 1882 and 1886, in the 1920s, you know, behavior such as breaking your curfew or being a truant or running away from home or simply being seen as unmanageable. There were laws called incorrigibility laws that said if someone, the police, someone in your community, or even your relative deemed your behavior unmanageable, then that was criminalized and you could be incarcerated for that. And so what I see is some of the same things happening, you know, in our present day. And I think what it reflects is that it's really easier to say that something is wrong with the person rather than the system or the society that that person has to navigate. Right. So these young women and girls, many of them that I looked at are working class and working poor. And these reformers really wanted to control their behavior. But the language that they used was that we're protecting them. But protecting them was really criminalizing a lot of the behavior that they deemed inappropriate.
I had to start taking notes while you all were talking, because all of the themes that you raised are issues that we address in our work today. So Dr. LeFlouria, when you were talking about convict labor, one of the things that came up to me is that folks in prison are paid for their labor, but it's pennies. And we are in the process of working on a report where, you know, one of the stats we have is something like women in California get 8 cents an hour for their work. And they have to pay $5 for copays for health care while incarcerated, which would basically be the equivalent of like a $600 copay, which is, you know, insane. But exactly your point about the ways in which the labor of incarcerated Black women has been used for the profit of companies. And then you mentioned slow violence, Dr. Harris, which made me think about the ways that we're trying to explore in our study of policing, how even everyday encounters with police are and can be violent. And so often when we talk about policing and the violence that people experience, it is the like very punctuated, you know, explosive event. And we don't think about how just the everyday encounters, the harmful ways in which we are spoken to, the threats, how that also can be a form of violence. And then Dr. Bailey, you talked about adultification, right? Which is like we see Black girls automatically as adults when they're in fact children, and we don't afford them that luxury of being treated and perceived as children. And then protection through the lens of control and criminalization, Dr. Harris, or Dr. Hicks, excuse me, just really reminds me of so much of the ways that we talk about the juvenile legal system and its impact on girls today, where there's this whole idea of like judicial paternalism, where, you know, we are putting you in youth detention to protect you. And that's still happening today. Actually, I think it wasn't until 2018 that incorrigibility was removed as a status offense in New York State. So all of the things that you're talking about, and you have seen in your research, that is decades and centuries really before where we are today are still showing up. And I think that's why we're having this conversation. Is it's not new. It is really the same thing happening, but because we haven't brought that kind of attention to the experiences of Black women and girls, it feels novel in this moment. And it gets talked about in that way when that's not the case. Which brings me to my next question for you all. You guys are probably like the most amazing detectives and sleuths, where you are finding the stories of folks that others haven't been able to find. You're looking through old newspaper archives, looking through the records of folks who are incarcerated in prisons and reformatories. And I'm curious about, if you could talk about why it's important that we do that kind of, deep dive and search for the stories of Black women and girls who are impacted by the criminal legal system that don't make the headlines. How has that really shaped and informed your work? Because I know it's important to each of you.
Well, I'll start as the junior scholar here. For me, like in trying to, there is no archive. I work on Parchman Penitentiary. They actually have an archive, but they don't want anyone to look at any of their records. And so for me, there's two books that have been written about this, notorious prison, and neither book really paid or gave Black girls or women much attention at all, right? Like they were just almost, essentially written out of these two stories, narratives of this sort of horrific prison. But if we think about Mississippi, we know that had the largest population of African Americans in the South after the war. So, and then just how Mississippi relied on Black labor, post Civil War to present. It just seemed to me that there had to be more there. And so for me, just going into the archive, not even knowing what I was actually looking for, and I saw in a biennial record, right, they were listing the individuals that were incarcerated. But they didn't have genders listed. They just had their names and ages. And I think I told you all about this 9-year-old little girl that I found. Essentially, and how I found her was that these two white men were writing letters. They were requesting a pardon for this young negress, is what they called her. And they were going on and on about how their wives needed help at home. And this young woman, they were calling her a young woman. Now, at the time they were writing about her, she was about 14 or 15. But they were saying that she was a burden on the state. They could take her off of the state's hands. And she, and they were just really invested in her labor and saying that she could come and help their wives, and one of the things that has always stuck to me, and then I've only ever found 3 newspaper articles about her, and they call her this a murderess. She's 9 years old. She's the youngest person ever to be incarcerated in the state of Mississippi, to be convicted, and sentenced to a 10-year prison term of hard labor. They made sure to put hard labor. And we are talking about a 9-year-old little girl. And so one of the things is, I had to just go and dig to find this story of, and I didn't know I was trying to find this story of this young girl, but I just always think about how many other heady records there are. And because these two men who, for whatever reason, were interested enough in her, that's how her story, and then her story is just relegated to this little 7 or 8 year period. You can't find her. The census, she's not in the census records. There's nothing else about her. So she was criminalized, dehumanized, and this is how history remembers her, through this finding of her in the archives, looking at governor's papers, right? And governor's records. And so one of the things, it's just always mindful for me to always remember that, sometimes we are just stuck anywhere. People don't really care enough about our history. And I think that's what's so important, even for me as a scholar, to look at my other senior scholars here with me and think about how important what they're doing and how they've sort of helped me think about my own history and what that means in recovering these histories that, frankly, some people could care less about unless we are the ones who are bringing these histories to light.
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. I think that's so important because oftentimes you find that you have to create the archive. I mean, you're taking this deep dive, but a lot of times you have to create the archive and write against, the state record, the records that you just spoke of. I mean, for me, I'm doing a project right now on New York City policing during the 1980s, and I've literally had to create an archive for myself. But I've been fortunate enough to talk to various different people. But I think in creating a kind of what many people would say diverse, kind of electric archive, elastic archive, I think you get to kind of really look at the community's response to what's happening to Black women and girls, the national response from various African American organizations and newspapers. I think you have an opportunity to look at or to hear the voices of Black people themselves, particularly Black women and girls who are telling their stories, as well as their family members. And I also think by taking a deep dive and thinking about different types of documentation, it really gives you a chance to talk about the nuances in police violence or just violence in general, state violence. For example, I'm writing something on Eleanor Bumpurs, who was murdered in 1984 by the NYPD. And I mean, we know that she was killed. This was during an eviction in '84, but she was policed in so many various ways even after her death. It's like the NYPD and the police union participated in like a post-mortem, vilification of her. And the other interesting thing about her and the policing of her body and her being victimized is, how her death certificate is signed by the coroner, by the medical examiner, right? That's a whole nother level of, policing and victimization, like this relationship between medical examiner's office and, district attorney's offices, as well as the NYPD. So I think by taking this deep dive, you get to look at, you're privy to all these different types of violences and stereotypes that are kind of mapped on Black women's bodies.
I think for me, looking at the kind of the prison records themselves, one would think that it is only about pathologizing these Black women in their communities. But I think if you go into those records looking at, asking a different set of questions, then that information in those records looks quite different. So the title of my, my first book, Talk With You Like a Woman, actually comes from the letter of one of those women, and I call her Lucy Cox. And she's writing back to administrators. She's been paroled, and they keep going back to her family members to say, how's she doing? Is she doing what she's supposed to be doing? Is she following the rules? And she gets wind of it and she writes them back and she's like, this is business. I want you to talk with me like I'm a woman. And there's a way in which that letter is in her case file. And it shows, the ways in which, she is adamant that she should actually be the person that folks are talking to. Don't talk over me. Don't talk, aside, from me. You actually need to, address me. And for her case, she actually says, I did the crime. but I had also done the time and you need to acknowledge me. And I wasn't expecting that in the archives. And one of the things that I find that, again, asking those questions and really trying to find the voices of the women. So the women and their communities were, came to the fore for me in ways that I had not expected. And there's, another example that I would give as well. These administrators were very invasive in terms of the questions that they would ask these women. And one of the questions that they asked was, when was the first time that you had sexual relations? And they also asked a question, which I think was really interesting, which was, were you raped? Or did you have, the language isn't sexual assault, but this, in terms of how I looked at it, gave these young women and the women and girls an opportunity to talk about those moments when they had been sexually assaulted, because it's not clear to me that anybody was asking them, right? And so I'm not sure if the women themselves thought it would go any further than what they told an administrator, but I actually thought it was really important for them to speak it into existence, and that it was documented. And when I saw it, I wrote about the ways in which they wanted people to know that they were violated by a family member or someone that they didn't know, or like their voice was really important. So the archives for me really allow for me to hear what these women thought was important, and to really, I felt that I needed to elevate those voices in the work. Not that I was creating them, but I was actually elevating what was in the records. And I don't think you can always imagine that that's what you will find in prison records, in records that are established to say that these folks are criminal and are not human.
Well, I just want to build on what Dr. Hicks and my other colleagues have mentioned about, number one, the difficulty in excavating the stories and the experiences of Black women and girls who are present in the archive, or what historian Deborah Gay White would say are everywhere yet nowhere, right? Like there are traces of their lives, of their lived experiences all throughout the archive. But as Black women historians, it is our responsibility to then take what's there and what's not, and to create a story, right? And so I feel like the methods that we use, by using whether it's informed speculation or what Sadia Hartman calls critical fabulation, to really in some ways try to interpret Black women's experiences, is as important as it is to try to identify and locate records that prove their existence. As we know, oftentimes these records are very flawed, but they're also very important. And regardless of the source, I use what Dr. Carolina Gross calls an elastic analytical framework to writing about these stories. And basically it's a way of saying the kitchen sink methodology, right? You can't throw anything away because there are just so many, oftentimes Black women's history is, and the stories of these women that we write about exist in little pieces, like little shreds of evidence, right? So I just want to, commend everyone, right, who's here in this room, and just let the audience know how difficult it is to write these stories, and how, like Dr. Harris said, you oftentimes have to create an archive or to create a methodology that allows you to even tell these stories in the first place. So I'll just say that for me, it's critically important to write about or to tell the stories of Black women and girls who have been either marginalized in the history or completely excluded from it. For me, it's important to give voice to them and to give voice to their experiences, because these were women and girls who had their voices taken away. And so in many ways, this is our opportunity to use their stories as an opportunity to better understand Black women's experiences today. And so in my current book project, whenever I do oral interviews with Black women who have been incarcerated, their stories are so eerily similar to the women that I wrote about, you know, from the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s and beyond. It's eerie and scary and disturbing all at the same time. And so while Black women, you know, who are formerly incarcerated are finding their voices and using their voices to promote change, I feel like using or excavating voices from the past to help, you know, elevate that work, right, that Black women are doing today, who justice involved Black women are doing today, is critically important.
Thank you. All of what you said resonates so much with the work that we're doing at the National Black Women's Justice Institute. I mean, creating the archive, I feel like whenever we're looking for data, it's so hard to find Black women in the data, because while there might be, and girls, while there might be data about the juvenile legal system and who's there, often it's not disaggregated by race and gender. So when you're looking at data about Black people, it may include Black women, but you don't know how many, and you don't know, and you can't see what were the similarities and or differences between their experiences and those of Black men or of white women and other women of color. And so I feel like a lot of our work is just trying to build up that repository of information so people can better understand and really can bring some visibility to the impact of the criminal legal system on their lives, and also just the importance of creating space for the voices of directly impacted Black women and girls. For us, we just think it's so important to elevate the voices, stories, and experiences, right? And we're all doing that work. And although our data for Black women and girls is just located at different points in time, we are coming close to the end. And so I want to ask folks a question about resistance before we open up to the Q&A. And so I'm just curious if you could talk about the ways in which you have seen in your work Black women and girls being at really the forefront of resisting and advocating against policing and the carceral systems. Are there historical examples that you've come across that really stand out to you that you think are important for us to keep in mind as we continue this liberatory work together?
I can
I
start.
could start by, I think I'd mentioned just the title of the book coming from a letter. I think resistance, I saw resistance in a number of ways. Women just speaking up for themselves in the moment, and they're written down as conduct infractions, writing to administrators to say, you know, this isn't, I'm not being treated well, and you know, I want certain changes, reporting police officer mistreatment in terms of hearings or going to court. But I also, like, Black women and girls are fighting back too, like physically fighting back. So like oftentimes these women encountered police officers in plain clothes, and those officers would say horrible things to them or would physically assault them. And there were so many cases, more cases than I actually imagined would happen, where the women were actually, you know, they fought back. I mean, the reason why I knew about their cases because, you know, they were arrested and incarcerated, but, you know, there were several cases of women who had their hats on and took the pin out of the hat and, you know, basically fought back against the police officer. So physically defending themselves was also something that I saw in terms of resistance. And I think it's important to keep in mind the different ways that these women went about trying to protect themselves.
I'll go next. So as I mentioned, I write about Black women who are incarcerated in Southern prison camps. and how slavery in many ways shaped their lived experiences. What I should also mention is that in some ways, slave resistance influenced the way that these women fought back against the system. And so the women that I write about, many of them were actually formerly enslaved women who became incarcerated and were re-enslaved through the penal system. And then their daughters and generations of women after that, and girls in particular, and girls, I should have mentioned that earlier. But these women, they did everything from set fires to break tools to, I remember reading cases of where, in one case, these women got together and burned down a building at the Georgia State Prison farm. They talked back, they quote unquote cursed their superiors. And all of this is documented in what were called whipping reports. And so the whipping bosses, who were the equivalent of overseers during slavery, kept very meticulous records. And they would document every quote unquote offense and the punishment that followed, right? And so looking at these records, I was able to see how women resisted. So these were not just records about, violence, but records of resistance. And so also, like Dr. Hicks mentioned, they were physically fighting back. And so and running away from the prison camp. So there are many examples that I can point to, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll say for me, in looking at the 80s, I'm finding that, you know how now you have the mothers of the movement, back in my research, I'm finding, you have the mothers, the aunties, the cousins, the children of these movements, and they're doing radio interviews, they're doing TV interviews, they're embarking on letter writing campaigns, they're going, like before the Bronx, outside of the Bronx Supreme Court and on the steps, and protesting the assistant district attorney, asking the DAs to push for harsher indictments, a whole, and doing that while grieving at the same time, right? So they feel that they have to pick up this mantle to humanize their loved ones and also do this political work. The other point that I want to make about, quote unquote resistance is that, at least in my work, there are some women and families that don't have the emotional bandwidth to resist, or not resist, but embark on social justice campaigns for their loved ones at the same time, right? So I have a case in 1984, Sharon Walker, who was killed by an off-duty police officer. She had 3 children. They were teenagers. And the rest of the family could not move. Like, their grief paralyzed them so much. And this is during the time of Eleanor Bumpers, Michael Stewart, like the big police cases of the 1980s. And this particular family, I spent a couple of months interviewing them, and just could not move. So, while you have people, particularly those who are, I guess, quote unquote, directly impacted by police violence, who find the courage and the emotional bandwidth to move, to advocate, to lobby for their loved ones, there are many families that can't do that work at that particular moment. I think that when we see these families on TV, the assumption may be that all families are doing this, and many families are not, because again, they just don't have the psychological, emotional bandwidth. They're still in that process of grieving and just even getting answers from the state, right?
And I'll just follow up. Thinking about, one of the things that I think particularly Black women and girls being active in sort of their own liberatory practice is writing their own pardon requests, right? Like calling out abuse in these letters, saying this person is mistreating me, or this person has done something to harm me. I've served my time, and so speaking on their own behalf. And one of the more interesting pieces, because I write, this sort of long history of this parchment, I do situate myself in the 50s and 60s, and particularly thinking about the Freedom Riders. Well, a lot has been written about the Freedom Riders, but one of the interesting things is that Freedom Riders were incarcerated at Parchment. And so then they were with, right, regular Mississippi women, girls and women who were serving time in Parchman, who used that as an opportunity to share stories of abuse and mistreatment. And then also saying, yeah, this guard, this is how you deal with this guard. We put something in his food, a couple weeks ago because he had done X, Y, and Z to one of us. And so, in just thinking that, oftentimes we know how hard the criminal, like this system is, like the prison system is, but to see Black girls and women actively participating in some type of liberatory practice, right? And not even thinking about the success of it, but just saying they were fighting for themselves. And it wasn't just that these prisons were overbearing, which they were, but we do see instances where it does make me sort of, think about sort of how Black girls and women were fighting back against this brutal system in many different ways.
Well, thank you all so much. We have only a few minutes and we have a few questions. And so, oh, hey, Kelsa, so good to see you. One of the questions that someone asked is regarding the psychological impact of slow violence on Black women and girls. I feel like Dr. LaShawn Harris, you mentioned that a little bit, but for any of you, how in your work have you seen evidence of the kind of psychological consequences related to the criminalization and punishment that Black women and girls have experienced?
I'll start first really quickly. I'm going back to Sharon Walker. She had 3 children, all teenagers, and each two girls and 2 daughters and 1 son. And all 3 of them had different life trajectories. One daughter, and again, I mean, first of all, a maternal loss, maternal void, right? And then you have one daughter who most of her life had been fearful of getting close to people. She was always afraid that someone was going to leave her. I had the other sister was someone who had unfortunately turned to substance abuse, and the son ended up participating in New York's drug economy of the 1990s. But all of them told me, had their mother still been alive, that their lives would have been something different. They felt like when they lost their mother, so what? Who cares? And I think for me, with the Sharon Walker case, it also speaks to the invisible stories of children who are impacted, or just families who are impacted, how the aftershocks of violence is like a ripple effect on the entire family. So for this particular family, this one event that happened in December of 1984 traveled for the next 10, 20 years.
Thank you. We also have another question from someone asking about whether you have seen in your research the intersection of disability and the criminalization of Black women and girls.
Can I say that? Speak to that only because Eleanor Bumpurs was someone who was deemed disabled, and while she was, deemed as someone disabled, she was still, portrayed by the NYPD, by the police union, and even by the media as someone who was able-bodied, someone who was capable of moving her body in a particular way that appeared to be threatening, right? Therefore, justifying them shooting her. But yes, in my work, and I don't explicitly do this in what I'm writing about, but she was someone who was seen as disabled, not just physically, but also mentally. Another case to look at in terms of disabilities, particularly if we're thinking about mental health, is the 2016 case. I think it's 2016. I could be wrong about this, but another Black woman who was shot in the Bronx by the name of Deborah Danner. I think that you know, she had schizophrenia, and if we're thinking about documents, we actually have letters written by her, and she talks about, you know, dealing with mental health, and she talks about hoping and praying not to be shot by the police, hoping that no one would call the police on her. So the mental health aspect piece is, I mean, we see this every single day, you know, obviously police should not be called when someone is having any type of mental health crisis, but even within those moments, they're still seen and demonized as dangerous and threatening bodies.
Well, thank you all so much. We are at time, and I just want to say how much I appreciate each and every one of you and the excellent conversation that we have had this evening. I definitely have learned so much more about why, well, your work and just this, you know, why it's so important that we do continue to engage with history, and just really the importance of the work that you are doing for us who are kind of trying to transform the system today to really understand the legacies of our criminal legal system and the harm it has caused Black women and girls in our communities.